He wore a badge to command the room, but he had no idea the woman standing in front of him carried the kind of truth that could end his career in a single sentence. The morning at Bryan County Courthouse was supposed to be ordinary, the kind of day where people lowered their voices, watched the clock, and pretended the walls did not hold years of pain. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows in pale gold strips, touching the polished floor, the wooden benches, the American flag in the corner, and the faces of strangers who had come seeking judgment, mercy, or both. In that quiet tension, Mariah Ellis sat with her hands folded in her lap, calm, and still, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She wore a simple navy coat, dark slacks, and low heels, nothing about her outward appearance demanding attention, which was exactly why Officer Caleb Voss decided she was easy to dismiss. He had that certain look some men wear when they think a uniform gives them the right to speak without respect. His jaw was tight, his smile thin, and his eyes moved over her like she was a problem he could solve by making it smaller. "You need to stand over there," he said, pointing toward a corner near the wall. His tone was flat, impatient. Already irritated by the idea that she had not moved quickly enough for him, Mariah lifted her eyes to him. Not angry. Not afraid. Just steady. "I'm here for the hearing," she said quietly. Caleb let out a short laugh that carried too much confidence and not nearly enough wisdom. "That's funny," he said, glancing at the clipboard in his hand. "This area is for parties with proper clearance. You can wait like everyone else." A few people nearby looked down. No one wanted to become part of the moment. That was the power of public humiliation. It did not always need a crowd to hurt. Sometimes one witness was enough. Mariah's gaze drifted to the case file on the table beside her, then back to Caleb. There was something in her silence that made the room feel smaller, as if time had paused to listen. Caleb stepped closer, lowering his voice in the way men do when they want control to sound like common sense. "I said move. You people always think rules don't apply to you until somebody makes them apply." The words landed hard not because they were loud, but because they were casual. Too casual. As if disrespect were just part of the job. A clerk at the far desk looked up briefly, then looked away again. Mariah did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She simply opened her handbag and reached inside with the slow precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Caleb noticed the motion and frowned. "What is that supposed to be?" he asked. Mariah drew out a leather wallet, held it for a moment, then let it rest in her palm. "My identification," she said. Her voice remained calm, almost soft, and that calmness unsettled him more than anger would have, because anger could be argued with. Calmness could only be measured. Caleb scoffed and crossed his arms. "Lady, I don't need a speech. I need you to follow instructions." Mariah looked at him for another long second, and the strange thing was the entire hallway seemed to lean in without moving. Even the air felt different. She thumbed open the wallet, and inside, beneath the clear protective sleeve, was a badge that had no business being ignored. Caleb's smirk hesitated. His eyes narrowed. He leaned forward just enough to read the lettering, and the color drained from his face in stages. First the certainty, then the arrogance, then the last fragile piece of his confidence. Because printed on that badge was a title he could not outrank, not with attitude, not with volume, not with the badge on his own chest. Mariah Ellis looked up at him then, and the room held its breath. "Officer Voss," she said, "you may want to speak more carefully." And in that single moment, the courthouse that had seemed so ordinary a second ago suddenly felt like the edge of a much larger truth, one that was already beginning to turn in her favor. For a moment, nobody in the Bryan County Courthouse hallway seemed able to move. Caleb Voss stood there with his shoulders squared, but the confidence that had filled him only seconds earlier was already thinning at the edges. Mariah Ellis did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She simply held his gaze with the calm of someone who had spent years watching people underestimate her and had long ago stopped being surprised by it. The clerk near the records desk lowered her eyes. A deputy at the far end of the hall pretended to study a notice board. Even the soft hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder than it should have. Caleb finally forced out a laugh, but it came out dry and uneven. "That little badge does not impress me," he said, though his eyes had already gone back to it once. and then again, as if his mind refused to accept what his mouth was saying. Mariah slid the wallet closed with a careful motion and tucked it back into her handbag. "It was never meant to impress you," she answered. "It was meant to be recognized." The words landed with quiet force. Caleb straightened his jaw, tightening. "You think showing me some plastic and metal changes what happens here?" he asked. "You are still in my courthouse." "No, Mariah," said her voice, even almost gentle. "This is a public courthouse. There is a difference." That answer seemed to irritate him more than any accusation could have. He took a step closer, trying to reclaim the space he felt slipping away. His hand rested near his belt in that practiced way men use when they want authority to speak before they do. But Mariah did not retreat. She stood exactly where she was, one hand resting lightly on her bag, the other relaxed at her side, as if she were waiting for the room itself to decide who it believed. A woman from the waiting area looked up from her paperwork, then quickly looked down again. The whole hallway had become a kind of quiet stage, and everyone on it could feel that something had shifted. Not loud enough for a crowd, not dramatic enough for an arrest, just enough to make the truth begin to press against the surface. "You have been warned," Caleb said, his voice lower now, rough with embarrassment. "I suggest you cooperate before this gets more difficult." Mariah studied him for a long second, and in that silence there was no fear, only patience. Then she said, "Officer Voss, you should be careful about using the word cooperate when you are the one stepping outside the line." A faint flicker crossed his face at that. It was small, but it was there. He did not like that she spoke with certainty. He did not like that she sounded like someone who had already seen the ending of this conversation. He reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder and spoke into it with an edge that tried too hard to sound controlled. "I need a supervisor near the main hallway," he said. Now, the response came back in a burst of static, and for the first time Caleb looked uncertain. Mariah did not react. She simply turned her head slightly toward the glass doors at the end of the corridor as if she were listening for something beyond the courthouse walls. A few seconds passed. Then a ringtone broke the silence. It was not Caleb's. It came from Mariah's handbag. The sound was soft, almost ordinary. But it changed everything. She reached inside, drew out a dark phone and glanced at the screen. The name displayed there made Caleb stiffen without knowing why. Mariah answered without breaking eye contact. "Yes," she said. Her tone was calm, professional, and unmistakably in control. "I am here." Caleb watched her face as she listened. One of the deputies shifted near the stairwell. The clerk stopped pretending to work. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door opened and closed. Mariah's expression never changed, but the room around her seemed to tighten. When she finally spoke again, her words were measured and clear. "No, there is no need to rush. He is already aware now." Caleb swallowed, aware of what he asked, though the answer was starting to rise in him before she gave it. Mariah lowered the phone slightly and looked directly at him. "Aware," she said, "that he has been speaking to a federal investigator with internal authority over this courthouse." The silence after that was absolute. The kind of silence that does not simply happen but falls. Caleb blinked once. Then again. The color left his face so quickly it was almost visible, as if every ounce of certainty he had worn into the building was being pulled out through the floor. The deputy at the end of the hall straightened. The clerk looked up. Mariah kept her voice soft, but every syllable carried. "You wanted me to follow instructions," she said. "Now it would probably help if you did the same." The words had settled over the hallway like a cold, invisible fog, and for a few long seconds nobody seemed willing to be the first person to breathe too loudly. Caleb Voss kept standing in place, one hand still near the badge on his belt, as if the metal itself might somehow restore the confidence he had already lost. Mariah Ellis remained calm, almost unnervingly, so her posture straight and her expression unreadable. The phone in her hand was no longer pressed to her ear, but she did not put it away. She simply let it rest there, quiet and steady, while the entire corridor waited for the next sound. At the records desk, the clerk finally looked down at the screen in front of her, then back up again, as if she had just realized she was watching something she had never been meant to witness. Down the hall, two deputies exchanged a quick glance and then looked away. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And in that silence, Mariah made the smallest motion with her free hand, a subtle gesture toward the side office with the frosted glass door. It was not a demand. It was worse than that. It was the kind of gesture that made it clear the decision had already been made somewhere above the level of ordinary conversation. Caleb noticed it and his jaw tightened. "What exactly is this?" he asked. Though the edge in his voice was gone, now replaced by something thinner and less controlled. Mariah turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "This," she said evenly, "is what happens when someone in a position of public trust forgets that every corridor has a witness and every file has a trail." Her tone was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried with the quiet certainty of a person who understood systems, procedures, and consequences far better than the man standing across from her. A soft chime sounded from the phone again, and this time Caleb heard it too. Mariah glanced down at the display, then looked back up with the same calm focus. "He is reviewing the report now," she said. Caleb frowned. Who is reviewing what report? Mariah took one slow step forward, enough to make him shift back without even realizing he had done it. "The federal notification that was sent 10 minutes ago," she answered. "The one documenting your conduct in this building. The one identifying the internal complaint already attached to your name. And the one that will be sitting on the right desk before this day ends." Caleb stared at her, searching her face for a crack, some sign that she was bluffing, exaggerating, anything he could use to steady himself. But there was nothing there except patience. Deep, controlled patience. The kind that came from knowing the truth did not need to hurry. Somewhere behind them, a door opened and shut. The sound was small, but it seemed to travel through the hallway anyway. Mariah did not even turn around. "You were told to wait," she said softly. "You chose not to." Caleb swallowed hard. His shoulders, which had looked so rigid just moments before, seemed to lose a little height. The deputy at the end of the hall had gone still. The clerk had stopped typing entirely. Even the fluorescent lights above them seemed harsher now, the white glare turning the polished floor into something colder, more exposed. Caleb tried once more to recover his voice. "You keep talking like you run this place," he said. Mariah let the silence breathe for a moment before answering. "No," she said. "I am simply the person they call when this place needs to be reminded of what the law is supposed to mean." That was when the side office door opened. The side office door opened slowly, and every person in the hallway seemed to hold their breath at once. A man in a dark suit stepped out first, tall, composed, carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone who did not need to raise his voice to be obeyed. He was followed by a woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a legal pad tucked neatly beneath her arm. Her eyes moved once across the hallway, taking in Caleb Voss, the deputy near the wall, the clerk at the desk, and Mariah Ellis standing in the center of it all with her phone lowered and her face calm as still water. Caleb stared at the man in the suit with a puzzled frown, as if trying to place him from somewhere deep in his memory. The man did not offer him that comfort. Instead, he turned directly to Mariah and gave her a respectful nod. "We are here now," he said, "and we heard enough to understand the problem." Caleb blinked. The deputy's posture changed instantly. The clerk went pale and sat up straighter in her chair. Mariah did not smile, but something in her expression softened by a fraction, as if the final piece of a long, quiet pattern had finally been set in place. "Thank you," she said. Her voice remained even, but it carried the kind of relief that never had to announce itself. Caleb looked back and forth between them. Confusion, hardening into something close to alarm. "Who exactly are you?" he asked, this time without the earlier edge because the edge was gone. The woman in glasses answered first. "Counsel for the Federal Review Board," she said. Then she looked at Mariah, and there was no doubt in her tone. "And she did not come here to be handled by anyone in this courthouse." The words landed like a heavy object in a silent room. Caleb's jaw tightened. He took one slow step forward, then stopped. All the confidence that had filled him only minutes earlier seemed to drain away under the fluorescent lights. Mariah set her phone down on the nearest counter, not because she was worried, but because she no longer needed to hold it. The recording had already done its work. The truth had already started moving. I asked for a simple answer, she said, keeping her tone level almost gentle. I was given a lecture, a warning, and a great deal of arrogance. She glanced once at the deputy, then back to Caleb. That should have been the moment to stop. Caleb looked as if he wanted to speak, but the room had become too small for excuses. The man in the suit opened a folder and removed several sheets of paper, each page crisp and official, each line of text carrying a weight that no badge could cancel out. He placed them on the clerk's desk with deliberate care. "These are the documents you were supposed to receive this morning," he said. "They confirm the transfer of oversight and the immediate review of conduct in this courthouse." The clerk stared at the pages as if they might disappear. The deputy shifted his feet and looked toward the floor. Caleb's mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. Mariah watched him for one quiet second, and in that silence there was no cruelty, only consequence. "You stood here and spoke to me as if I was beneath you," she said. "You interrupted me as if my time meant nothing. You chose suspicion before you chose courtesy." Her voice remained calm, but each sentence seemed to draw a line in the air that could not be erased. "That is not strength. That is a habit, and habits can be corrected." The man in the suit gave a small, almost imperceptible glance toward Caleb, then toward the deputy, and the entire hallway seemed to understand what was happening without anyone needing to say it out loud. This was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was about a system finally meeting the person assigned to hold it accountable. Caleb swallowed hard. For the first time he looked less like an officer, and more like a man standing in front of a truth he had never expected to face. And Mariah, steady and unshaken, stood exactly where she had been all along, waiting not for permission but for the moment the room would finally catch up to her. And when it did, everyone there could feel it. The law had not moved. It had simply arrived. The hallway had gone so still that even the smallest sounds seemed louder than they should have been. A paper shuffled near the clerk's desk. Someone cleared their throat, and then regretted it immediately. Caleb Voss stood under the fluorescent lights with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the man in the suit, as if staring hard enough might somehow change the meaning of the moment. But the moment did not bend for him. It only grew heavier. The silver-haired woman beside the federal official rested one hand on her legal pad and let her gaze move once across the hall before settling on Mariah. There was no surprise in her expression now. Only recognition. "I think we have enough to proceed," she said in a calm voice that carried all the way to the far end of the corridor. Mariah did not move. She simply stood there, composed and still, the kind of stillness that made other people feel their own nerves more sharply. Caleb finally drew in a breath, but it sounded unsteady, almost thin. "Proceed with what he asked," though the question came out more guarded than brave. The man in the suit did not answer him right away. He looked at the badge on Caleb's chest, then at the county seal on the wall, and then at the line of people watching from every corner of the hallway. With what should have been handled properly from the beginning, he said. No one spoke after that, not because they had nothing to say, but because every person there understood the difference between authority and performance. Caleb had been performing. Mariah had not. She had not needed to raise her voice, threaten anyone, or fight for attention. The room had begun to turn the moment she stopped being treated like a stranger and started being treated like what she was. The clerk, who had been pretending to focus on a stack of forms, now looked openly unsettled. The deputy near the wall shifted his weight and glanced toward Caleb, then away as if hoping not to be pulled into whatever this had become. The federal official opened the folder in his hand and removed a few pages, each one arranged with careful precision. He did not hurry. He did not need to. "Officer Voss," he said, "this matter was already under review before you decided to make it personal." Caleb's face changed at once. Not all the way. Just enough. A flicker of color left his cheeks. His shoulders stiffened. His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since Mariah had arrived, he looked less certain of himself than he wanted anyone to see. Mariah watched him with quiet patience, and that patience was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. "You keep standing there like this is still your hallway," she said softly. "It is not." Those words landed without force, but they landed deeply. The federal official lifted his eyes from the folder. "Miss Hayes," he said, "if you are ready, we can move to the conference room." That simple sentence changed the air again. Not because it was dramatic, because it was respectful, because it acknowledged her in a way the hallway had not. Mariah gave a small nod. "I am ready," she said. Caleb stepped half a pace forward, then stopped himself. His instincts had finally caught up with his pride, and for a brief second, they seemed to argue with each other right there in front of everyone. "Conference room?" he asked, trying to sound in control and failing just enough for people to notice. The woman with the glasses answered before the federal official could. "Yes," she said. "The part of this building where facts are actually allowed to speak." It was not a cruel line. That was what made it hurt more. The deputy looked down. The clerk swallowed. Caleb stared at Mariah as if trying to place her again, trying to force the world back into the shape he had preferred an hour ago. But nothing fit anymore. The hallway had changed. The rules had changed. And Mariah, standing in the center of it all with perfect stillness, looked less like someone who had arrived late and more like someone who had been expected all along. The federal official closed the folder and turned slightly toward the side corridor. "Let us not waste any more time," he said. "This is becoming a matter of record." At that, the air seemed to tighten one last time. Caleb heard it. Everyone did. A matter of record meant paper. Paper meant signatures. Signatures meant consequences that did not disappear when the room emptied out. And suddenly the officer who had tried to control everything with posture and tone found himself trapped inside something far more serious than embarrassment. Mariah took one measured step toward the conference room, then paused just long enough to look at him. Her expression did not change. Her voice did not rise. "You said I should follow instructions," she said. "I am." Then she moved forward, and the entire hallway watched her go, knowing with growing certainty that the story was no longer about who had been ignored. It was about who had finally arrived to answer for it. The corridor outside the conference room felt narrower now, as if the building itself had grown tired of pretending this was only a routine matter. Mariah stood near the open doorway, with her hands relaxed at her sides, calm in a way that unsettled everyone who had mistaken silence for weakness. Caleb Voss remained where he was stiff-backed and red-faced, while the deputy who had followed him earlier kept glancing between the folder in the federal official's hand and Mariah's unreadable expression. No one wanted to speak first. No one wanted to be the one whose words would later appear in a record. Then the man in the dark suit looked down at the paperwork he had just reviewed, and his face changed in a way that was almost too subtle for the others to catch, but not subtle enough to hide the significance. He lifted his eyes slowly. "This is deeper than anyone here was briefed on," he said, his voice even controlled and absolute. The clerk at the desk froze, with both hands resting on the edge of the counter. Caleb swallowed once and tried to hold on to the kind of posture that had carried him through smaller rooms and easier men, but that posture was failing him now. "What exactly does that mean?" he asked, though the question came out flatter than he intended. Stripped of the force he had relied on only minutes before. The federal official did not answer immediately. He turned one page, then another, as if the paper itself were speaking more clearly than any person in the hall. Mariah watched him without moving, the overhead lights reflecting softly in her eyes. There was no rush in her. No need to force the moment. That was what unnerved Caleb most. She did not look like someone waiting to win. She looked like someone who already understood how this would end. At last, the official closed the folder and held it against his chest. "There was an internal concern raised this morning," he said. "Then another one, then a formal review request. By the time your name reached the right desk, the situation had already been documented 3 times over." The hallway seemed to absorb that sentence and return it as a warning. Documented. Reviewed. Logged. Words like that did not shout. They stayed. They followed. They lived longer than outrage. Caleb's throat tightened. He looked toward the deputy as if expecting rescue, but the deputy had gone still. The kind of stillness that came from realizing his own place in the room had suddenly become smaller than he liked. Mariah finally stepped farther into the light, not to challenge anyone, but to make it impossible for anyone to pretend not to see her. Her voice remained quiet, measured and clear. "I told you I was not here by accident," she said. "I told you I was not here to argue for respect. I was here because this case was already moving before any of you decided to make it personal." Caleb's face shifted, the anger draining out of him in uneven waves that left something less confident behind. He looked at her as if the shape of the moment had changed into something he no longer recognized. The federal official nodded once, almost to himself, then opened the folder again and drew out a second document. The paper had a thicker seal at the top, the kind that did not come casually and did not go away without consequences. "Effective immediately," he said. "All direct action on this matter is suspended pending transfer to federal oversight." The words landed with a quiet finality that rippled through the hallway. The clerk's mouth parted slightly. The deputy stared at the floor. Caleb blinked hard once, then again, as if refusing to let the sentence become real would somehow keep it from happening. But it was already happening. Mariah did not smile. She did not need to. Justice, when it finally spoke, did not always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it arrived as a signature, a seal, and a room full of people realizing too late that the person they had underestimated was never there to ask for permission. She looked at Caleb one last time, her expression steady and human, and said, "Power can make a room loud. Truth makes it permanent." Then she turned toward the conference room, and the hallway followed her with its eyes, feeling the weight of a simple fact settling over everything they had tried to control. The law had not been defeated here. It had only been delayed long enough for everyone to reveal who they really were. By the time Mariah stepped fully into the conference room, the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be measured by words alone. It was not just quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes when people realize they have been standing on borrowed ground, speaking with borrowed certainty. And now the truth has entered the room, wearing a calm face and carrying a federal seal. Caleb Voss stood near the head of the table with his jaw tight and his hands locked at his sides, trying to look like a man still in control, but control had already begun slipping from him in small, invisible pieces. The folder on the table remained open, its contents visible enough to be understood and impossible to ignore. Names, dates, recordings, signatures, a paper trail that no amount of pride could erase. Mariah did not rush. She moved with the steady patience of someone who knew that real authority never needed to announce itself twice. Behind her, the federal official had taken one quiet step aside, giving her the center of the room without a single word of request. That alone said everything. Across the table, the deputy who had followed Caleb in kept staring at the documents as if they might rearrange themselves into something less damning. They did not. They stayed exactly as they were, still and final, like evidence that had outlived every excuse built to deny it. Mariah placed one hand lightly on the edge of the table and looked around the room, letting each face settle under the weight of her presence. "This was never about a misunderstanding," she said, her voice even and clear. "It was about a choice." Nobody interrupted her. Nobody could. She turned her gaze to Caleb, who swallowed once and tried to hold her stare, but found he could not do it for long. There was something in her stillness that made his own impatience look small. Something in her composure that made his authority feel temporary. "You treated silence like surrender," she continued. "You treated courtesy like fear. You treated a woman standing alone as if she stood there without support, without record, without consequence." Her words did not rise. They did not need to. They entered the room one by one and stayed there. The clerk at the side wall lowered her eyes. The deputy shifted his weight. Even the air seemed to tighten. Mariah reached into the folder, lifted a page, and held it just long enough for everyone to see the official stamp in the corner. Then she set it back down with careful precision. "In this country," she said, "power is not supposed to decide who deserves dignity. The law is." Caleb gave a short, disbelieving breath. The kind that comes when a person is trying to hold on to a version of himself that no longer fits the room he is standing in. "You cannot just come in here and change everything," he muttered, though even he sounded unconvinced by the sentence as it left his mouth. Mariah met him with a look that was neither cruel nor soft, only certain. "No," she said. "I did not come here to change everything. I came here because everything had already been changed by people who thought they would never be held to account." For a moment nobody moved. Then the federal official at the side of the room cleared his throat and laid another document beside the first. It was quiet. It was routine. And somehow it landed harder than any raised voice could have. Caleb's face drained as he read the heading. The room saw it happen. The last trace of defiance faded from his expression, replaced by the unmistakable look of a man realizing that the floor beneath him had been legally removed. Mariah watched him with steady eyes. There was no triumph in her face, only the kind of sadness that comes when truth arrives late but still arrives. "You wanted this to be about rank," she said. "But rank is temporary. Character is what remains when the title is gone." The clerk looked up at last. Her expression changed by the simple fact of hearing someone speak plainly in a room built on fear. The deputy slowly closed the folder in front of him, as if he finally understood that proximity to power had never made him right. Mariah drew a slow breath and let it out before speaking again. "This room will remember what happened here," she said. "Not because of the argument, and not because of the shame. It will remember because one person was expected to bow, and instead, she stood still long enough for the truth to be seen." Caleb stared at her speechless now, as the full meaning of her words settled over him. Mariah did not glance away. She did not need to. The room itself had already turned. The silence that followed was not empty anymore. It was full of realization, full of regret, full of the kind of justice that does not need to shout to be heard. And as Mariah turned toward the door, every person in that room understood the same thing at once. The mistake had never been hers. The mistake had been assuming that she was the kind of woman who would disappear when tested. She was not. She was the reason the truth had finally found a voice. Mariah did not leave the conference room the way other people would have left it. She did not rush. She did not look over her shoulder. She simply stepped into the hallway as though the building had finally learned her name and decided to keep it. Behind her, the room remained sealed in a silence so complete that even the distant hum of the ventilation system seemed to hesitate. Caleb Voss stayed where he was, his face drained of the easy confidence he had worn so carelessly before. The others did not move at all. They were still sitting with the same stiff backs, the same frozen hands, the same stunned expressions that come when certainty breaks in half right in front of you. Mariah walked with measured steps, her federal seal catching the light in soft flashes as she passed beneath the long overhead fixtures. In any other moment the hallway would have felt ordinary. But not now. Now it felt charged, as if every framed photograph on the wall, every polished door, every closed office was holding its breath and waiting for the next word that would decide what kind of day this had become. She stopped only once near the corner where the corridor widened toward the elevators and turned her head slightly as though listening to a sound no one else could hear. It was not fear. It was not hesitation. It was the quiet patience of someone who understood that truth did not need to run. Truth only needed time to reach the people who had been pretending not to see it. A few steps behind her, the federal agent from the side office emerged without a word and gave her a respectful nod. He did not interrupt. He did not offer praise. He simply confirmed with the smallest movement that the paper trail had already begun and that the record would not be shaped by rumor pressure or arrogance. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door closed. Then another. Mariah continued forward, her expression calm, her shoulders level, her eyes clear. She had already endured the kind of room that tries to shrink a person before it ever learns who that person is. She had already heard the tone that people use when they mistake familiarity for authority and cruelty for strength. And now, after all of it, she was the one leaving with her dignity untouched. There was something almost painful in that kind of calm. It unsettled people more than anger ever could. Anger could be dismissed. Calm could not. As she reached the elevator bank, two staff members stepped aside without being asked, their faces pale, with the realization that they had witnessed something they would be thinking about long after the day was over. Mariah did not demand an apology from them. She did not need to. The lesson had already begun. One of the men, no older than 30, swallowed hard and looked down at the floor, as if ashamed to meet her eyes after watching the room turn against itself. Mariah noticed, but she did not punish him for understanding too late. Instead, she said quietly, "The hardest part is never telling the truth. It is watching people decide how long they want to stay blind to it." The words landed with the kind of weight that made no sound at all. The man nodded once slowly, as if that sentence had reached him in a place where excuses could not live. When the elevator arrived, its polished doors opened with a soft chime that sounded far too gentle for what the last few minutes had carried. Mariah stepped inside and turned to face the hallway one final time. She could still feel the room behind her, still sense the shape of the fear it was trying to hide under professionalism and stillness. But fear was not the point. Never had been. The point was that once the truth had been spoken clearly enough, loudly enough, and calmly enough, the entire atmosphere changed. People who had been certain began to doubt themselves. People who had been cruel began to remember the cost. And people who had been dismissed began to stand a little straighter, because they had seen what happened when a woman refused to fold under pressure. As the elevator doors began to close, Mariah lifted her chin slightly, not in pride, but in finality. This was not the end of the story. It was the moment the room could no longer hide from what it had done, and somewhere above in that same conference room where every breath had once sounded heavy, Caleb Voss was finally forced to sit alone with the one thing he had spent the entire day avoiding. Not punishment. Not shouting. Just the truth. And the truth, once it arrives, never asks permission to stay. By the time the elevator reached the ground floor, Mariah had already become something impossible to ignore. Not because she raised her voice. Not because she demanded attention. She did neither. She simply carried herself with the quiet certainty of someone who had already seen the full shape of the truth and no longer needed permission to stand inside it. The lobby looked different now. The same polished stone, the same glass walls, the same steady lights overhead, and yet everything felt altered, as if the building itself had realized that a line had been crossed and that no amount of silence could cover it now. People near the front desk straightened as she passed. A security guard who had looked uncertain earlier suddenly found the floor very interesting. A pair of employees near the doors stopped talking altogether, not because anyone ordered them to, because the air had changed, because they could feel, in the simplest and most human way, that the balance of the day had shifted for good. Mariah did not look back at the conference room above her. She did not need to. What had happened there would travel faster than any elevator ever could. A few minutes earlier, they had seen her as a problem to manage, a voice to contain a woman they could delay until she got tired and left. Now, they understood the mistake. She had never been there to beg. She had come to make the truth impossible to avoid. And once truth enters a room, it does not leave the same way it arrived. It settles in. It changes the temperature. It makes every excuse sound smaller than it did before. Somewhere behind her, footsteps moved in the direction of the elevators, but Mariah kept walking at the same measured pace, her hands calm at her sides, her expression composed in a way that almost felt louder than anger ever could. Imagine standing there and realizing the person you tried to dismiss was the one person who never needed to raise her voice to win the room. That was the kind of power this moment carried. Not spectacle. Not noise. Authority. The kind that comes from being right when everyone else has spent too long pretending they are not wrong. Outside, the afternoon light fell across the entrance steps in a soft wash of gold, and Mariah paused only once, just long enough to let the doors close behind her. For a brief moment, she stood in the threshold between what had been denied and what could no longer be hidden. She breathed in slowly. The city moved on around her. Cars passed. People hurried by. Somewhere a siren sounded in the distance and faded into the ordinary rhythm of the street. But inside that building, nothing would feel ordinary again. Not for Caleb Voss. Not for the staff who had watched him mistake arrogance for control. Not for the people who had stayed quiet when they should have spoken. They had all learned the same lesson too late. A woman like Mariah could be underestimated for only so long before the entire room had to face what it had done. And the hardest part was not the exposure. It was the waiting. The long, terrible pause before accountability finally arrived and asked everyone to remember exactly who they had chosen to be. Mariah descended the front steps with steady grace, the sunlight touching her face as if it recognized her before anyone else did. She did not need applause. She did not need revenge. What she carried was heavier and cleaner than both. She carried proof. She carried presence. She carried the kind of truth that does not scream, but still changes everything it touches. And high above her, behind glass and closed doors, Caleb Voss was left alone with the silence he had created. A silence that no longer protected him. A silence that now sounded exactly like consequence. Because when a room spends too long mistaking dignity for weakness, the moment the truth arrives, it does not ask to be believed. It simply stands there until everyone else finally has to.